SolidStart 1.0, the shape of frameworks to come. This is a pretty exciting release. It's no secret that I've been a big fan of Solid for a while, especially Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid. The team he's formed, the things he's built, the way he's pushed the ecosystem is hard to put into words. There probably isn't any other person in the space that knows other frameworks as well as Ryan does. He's been a phenomenal source of info, not just of Solid or of Signals or all the cool things happening there, but of the ecosystem as a whole. And I've learned so much from him. I've had incredible conversations with him. And as such, I can't really have anything but excitement as I read this. So no going in, I'm a little biased because I love Solid, I love Ryan, but this is a really exciting release. I want to take time to go over it. So without further ado, let's talk about SolidStart 1.0, my favorite JavaScript framework and my second most used. There's some bold statements in here too, by the way. I pre-read, but I pre-read an old version, so I'm excited to see this one. The role of server rendering in JavaScript is growing. In pursuit of performance and optimization, everything points to leveraging the server more. It's also clear that it isn't getting any easier to get started with this technology. People were having a hard enough time as it was with their Webpack configs, and now we need to do a lot more to play nicely on the server. I just recorded a whole video about Remix and React Router where I talked a lot about the same stuff. Webpack was rough at the time. Webpack, once you're also dealing with servers, a lot rougher. Something needed to be done, but it needed to be done right. Oof. You're getting so good with the pros, Ryan. Something easy enough that one could get started without much effort, but not so opinionated that you're stuck on specific technologies. The solution needed to appeal to everyone and not fracture our growing ecosystem. This is, again, one of those things that not many frameworks get right. And I think React as a whole has had a really good record with. Even with people upset with some of the new stuff, the fact that React is so backwards compatible is an achievement. And it seems like he's trying to go a similar direction with Solid, which makes a lot of sense because the ergonomics and even some of the mindset in Solid definitely takes some meaningful inspiration from React. Fortunately, Vite 2.0's release showed the way that this could be done, and the rest was history. Or that's what I would like to say. But the truth was, there was still a lot more to figure out. Multiple rewrites, 2 beta phases, and a lot of learning. But 3 years later, we have reached our first major release. This part's important too. I don't think like Vite doesn't just solve the problem. As important and incredible as Vite is, it at the time was just another bundler. They slowly added features to make it easier to do server-side and client-side stuff, but it was very, very primitive and not very, very clear how to use it. There have been a lot of cool projects like Nitro. If you're not already familiar with Nitro, it is the next generation server toolkit. It's the set of tools to build server-side stuff in Vite. So if you're building your own equivalent of a Next or Remix or Solid, we finally are starting to get the tools built on top of the tools, built on top of the tools necessary to do that right. Because Vite's built on top of Rollup and ESBuild, and now Nitro is built on top of Vite. Now we have a layer that makes sense to start building our own frameworks on top of, but getting there in the first place, that's been rough. And it's really cool to see things like Nitro as well as Vinxi. Thank you for bringing that one up too. Vinxi, the full stack JavaScript SDK to build full stack apps and frameworks with your own opinions, powered by Vite and Nitro. Okay, so the layering is now ESBuild and Rollup with Vite on top, with Nitro on top, and then Vinxi as the top layer there, so you can then build your framework on top. Chaos, it's getting there. A lot of progress has been made, and Solid has historically been one of the earliest consumers of these things. It's Vinci. Cool. It's spelled Vinxi, so it's called Vinxi now. Sorry to the creators. I'm calling it how it's spelled. Yeah, we get the idea though. Just having Vite kind of know what servers is was not what we needed. We needed to build tools on top first in order for things like SolidStart to be viable, much less good, maintainable, and standards following. So speaking of which, what even is SolidStart? SolidStart's a JavaScript framework designed to build Solid.js applications and deploy them to a variety of providers. This doesn't sound all that different from most other JS frameworks, but the devil is in the details. There is some very interesting details we need to go over here too. Everything is a la carte. SolidStart is designed first and foremost to be a starter. This is a big difference from other frameworks where like Next.js isn't designed to be a starter so much as a framework that includes everything you might need and makes it easy to add things on top. The minimal starting point with something like Next is pretty hefty. The minimal starting point with SolidStart is very, very small. The basic setup without installing any libraries produces a Hello World example that is only 5 kilobytes of minified.js and gzipped. Don't want to use additional libraries? Don't worry, you don't have to. SolidStart's base does not lock you into any specific conventions. Adopting some of the ones we provide in SolidStart will often provide the best experience, but it isn't mandatory to pay the price of features that you don't need and that you're not using. I wish more frameworks took this mindset. To be fair, the ones that I recommend, like Next, which we'll be saying a lot throughout this, the bundle size has slowly crept up, but we're still only in the like 200 kilobyte range, so it's not the worst, but it's still not the best. And if you actually have a static page that doesn't need a router, that doesn't need all of the like routing, URL management, server streaming stuff, you're just writing a hello world, it should be 5 kilobytes of JavaScript. The idea of a framework that scales up and down, depending on how much or how little you use, is something that we've talked about for a while with things like the magic promise of tree shaking that never really came true. This is one of the few frameworks that's built on top of that. It's almost like progressive enhancement, but for not this magical imaginary idea of not writing JavaScript. It's progressive enhancement in the amount of JavaScript that is being included based on how much you are or aren't doing. Bring your own application router. Here's where things get even more interesting, because almost every other one of these frameworks is also a router. Next.js is a router. In fact, the whole Next 13 fiasco was because of the introduction of App Router. Next 13 isn't where things changed. App Router is where they changed. You could have just kept using Pages Router, but the confusion of Next being a router and a framework has resulted in people just not understanding, and that blurriness has sucked. Even Remix kind of just went through this, where Remix and React Router were intermingled, but the relationship was unclear. So they sacrificed the Remix brand temporarily in order to push things in the React Router direction to make it clear the router is the core piece. Not in SolidStart. You can bring your own router. SolidStart does have file system routing. It uses a similar convention to Nuxt, where parameters are passed via an array syntax. However, we also use parentheses as a way to do more powerful things, like route groups, named index routes, and as a way to break out of nesting. Basically, whatever you put between the parentheses is removed from the matching, but it still impacts the structure of your routes. This is a cool pattern that's also in Next.js, where you can tell it, like, hey, this is me grouping folders. Don't make this part of the route definition. Just let me put things here instead. So you can have like /dashboard, and you can have 3 different sections, like user, profiles, data, and those 3 different groups don't affect the routing, so they're all still on /dashboard. Really nice pattern. Still feel like reading through the routes folder is not the most pleasant experience in any of these frameworks. I'll drop the hot take of SvelteKit does this the best. I obviously don't ship a whole lot of Svelte, so it's quite possible I'm just wrong about all of this and what the DX is like. But one of the cool things they do in Solid is all of the routing things have a plus in front in the name, which might seem unnecessary and tedious, but the very simple benefit of putting the plus in front is that now these things will rise to the top in your file tree because they're sorted alphabetically. So it's such a dumb hack, but just putting the plus in front means everything related to your routing will be at the top of the folder when you're looking at it in VS Code or whatever editor you're using if it has a file tree. And everything that isn't part of the routing is just right underneath. It's a small thing, but I like that a lot, and I wish more things copied that. That said, this looks pretty familiar to me. It's almost like a hybrid of like Remix or Nuxt and Next.js, taking a lot of the best parts, but I do miss the plus in front. The configuration that we get from the file system is then passed back to the application to be used in the router of your choice. This is one of those, I've never seen it before, borderline groundbreaking things that's really exciting to me. I know that Tanner's working on some similar stuff with TanStack Router, but the idea that the file router is just a way to get routes, not a way to bundle your whole framework and application, is really interesting, because you can just import the file routes and make them part of your application this way. This makes things like incremental adoption actually viable. This makes things like writing custom route behavior on top that makes certain things more dynamic than a file router allows trivial. This makes so many cool things possible that I haven't seen other frameworks even really consider. I've never even thought, like, what if I could import the file router inside of my router? What if I could just import this as a component and mount it how I want to for the way I want to build my app? Really cool stuff. Also, Expo has a router too, and they've copied a lot of things. That's a good point. I should definitely talk about Expo router more in the future. This is really interesting, though. I want to dig into this. Here we're seeing the file routes get dumped inside of the Solid router, but you could use any router you wanted. You could fork Solid router. You could use any of the others that exist already. You could build your own crazy patterns and solutions here. The fact that the file router is just a component, or the file routes are just a component, is one of those like mind-blowing, that's different moments for me. So how do we configure the routes then? Our route export lets you define your custom route config. We automatically lazy wrap the default exported component, and we add it to your config under the component property. So here we have the config, which has an export constant route equals load, void get story. So this is getting the data or whatever else we want. Match filters, ID. This is for only allowing numbers for the ID. And this satisfies route definition. Satisfies as like a thing framework authors can recommend is still really OP. I love this. Then we export the default function, myRoute component. Now we have a configured route that has this particular match, has a way to load data. Now we can call this wherever we want. You can set your own types and use the router of your choice, configured how you want in your projects. Oof. So cool. Enough about the routing. Now we get to talk about everyone's favorite thing, progressive enhancement. But it's, again, the Solid way, which isn't anything like the current solution. It's not really traditional progressive enhancement. Let's see what I mean by that. The server enhances. No rewrites here. SolidStart was built as a single-page app framework first. Every feature is designed to work with all the libraries you already use. To do so required us to carefully consider how we add server-only capabilities. This is what led to us pioneering server functions in early 2022, a feature that has since made its way into several popular frameworks. I'm curious what you have linked here. Yeah, Next.js has server actions and mutations. Yep. Quick has server $. Yep. Solid was real early with this, especially in the Bling era. Real throwback. Does anybody have the Bling? Yeah, Tanstack Bling. For those who weren't around when this happened, so it was a bit of a niche moment, Tanner and Ryan and a few others were working on some primitives in order to write a server function anywhere in your code, and then a compiler would turn that into an endpoint and just replace it with a fetch. So you could write server $, do some server-only stuff here, and then this function that you get as a result can be used in client code totally fine. It's almost like inverse server components now that we know server components, but at the time, server components were still just barely a thought. Nobody was really using them yet, and they wanted a better way to do async server-side code inside of client code. It's like embedded TRPC, where it's not from a different file being imported and using a bunch of TypeScript hacks. Just write it and let the bundler handle it. Really cool stuff. But it's since not the focus, and I believe SolidStart, as well as all these other solutions, have built their own things now instead. But Bling was the first attempt at trying to make a standard solution that everyone could adopt. So they were very much first here. It's cool to see everybody else copying, but their new way of doing it is really cool as well, because they did another one of those solid things that I haven't seen anybody else really take advantage of. Can you guys stop saying it's almost directly inspired by Blitz? It's not. You guys just don't know how Blitz works. Blitz lets you define your behaviors in other files, and then you import them. But the Blitz pipelines for data have to be somewhere else. This Blitz is much closer to TRPC than it is to Bling. Bling lets you, inside of your client code, write server code. Different thing. It's Bling, not Blitz. Nikhil said it in a stream. Anyways, I want to talk about a solidism, because there's another little thing Solid does that I think is really, really clever, and I wish more frameworks did. You might have noticed earlier, if you're a React dev that isn't familiar with Solid, that this code probably looks familiar. This just looks like React code, because nothing here would be valid in React and invalid in Solid, or vice versa. The syntax for managing your state in Solid is different, and the idea of what a component does is very different. But the syntax, and as such, a lot of other things, look almost directly the same. The thing that's interesting here is that you're able to use a lot of the tooling that was built around React when you're using Solid. Things like JSX and TSX compilers and transpilers just work. Things like syntax highlighting and linting in your editor just work. Other frameworks like Astro have had to build crazy things around building prettier plugins to work with Astro syntax, around building their own syntax highlighter so it works in your editor of choice. Solid gets to skip all of that because they take these things that are good enough from another ecosystem and then ride their coattails in order to build the thing they actually want to build, which is a better framework. This is where I think the server enhancement stuff and the server functions get really, really interesting, because the same way they were able to reuse JSX syntax to not have to reinvent all those things, they're also reusing a syntax that's kind of new. They're reusing useServer. By taking useServer, they're able to ride the coattails of all the work going to make useServer work in bundlers, frameworks, ecosystems, tooling. And it's a pattern now. useServer isn't a thing that has to be just React's thing. And Ryan has done a great job here realizing that these concepts can be taken and that these syntaxes can be taken and used in a different way, but now you have all of the tooling that's already been built around it. By adding useServer to a function, it is only executed on the server, either being naturally called on the server or used as an RPC from the client. Server functions are transparent from a TypeScript perspective, and they can fit into your existing APIs, like fetches and Tanstack query. How cool is that, though? How cool is that you can just have a query function that is how you're getting, in this case, the data for posts in a blog or something. And then we just call useServer here. Now the bundler knows this can only run on the server, not the client. So make sure this gets run on the server. And if we call in the client, then it gets RPC'd. If we call it on the server, it just runs. We get the event. If there's no user ID, then we throw an error. If there is a user ID, then we grab all their posts and we return them. Now we have this data in this query call that we can then use for things. So cool. It's really nice seeing people take advantage of this tooling, not just as a wow, they have all of that. Because it's easy if you're a framework author to be jealous that things like TypeScript support, editor support, all those things exist in other frameworks and not yours, and trying to catch up sucks. Solid doesn't want to innovate on those things. They want to make a great performant framework and new way of building things. So they ride those paths that already exist and build something new on top. I love this because it normalizes these ideas. When I was earlier in my web dev career and I first saw Solid and I saw something that was so much faster than React, but it looked like React. Oh, so cool. So cool. It proved to me that things like JSX aren't a React concept. They're a development concept. And that's what I see here too. It's funny to think, But the future of people understanding these primitives, like understanding use server, that might not be something the React team teaches. It might be something the Solid team teaches. How crazy would it be if people finally understand that use server isn't for components because of Ryan, not because of React? Anyways, let's talk about why this is cool. In this way, everything works the way you'd expect on the server and the client during the initial SSR or even during future navigations, whether you're fetching data or if you're doing mutations. And even if you are purely doing client-side rendering in the browser, it still works. Our server functions support advanced serialization for this, like async iterables, streams, and promises, ensuring you build the APIs you want. This is also a really cool part. If you return a promise here, do you have to await the thing that you return? What happens to it? Because effectively, when this is RPC'd, this is returning JSON. JSON can't have a promise. JSON's very primitive. But if you have a smart bundler that effectively bundles the response and then a smart client that can parse it and do things with it, you can send a thing that indicates to the client, hey, wait for this part. It's going to come through the stream later, which is a really powerful thing, especially if you don't have to think about it and it all just comes through in a type-safe, easy to integrate fashion. The idea that you can kind of just return whatever here and the framework handles it for you, that's really cool. These are the types of things I like frameworks doing for you. We've used this capability to do things like single file mutations with Solid's router API, which lets the server start fetching the data for the next page after an update and stream it back on the same response with the client handling the redirects. Between this, the parallelized local and cache patterns, as well as Solid's non-blocking async, we've all but eliminated unnecessary waterfalls. Ryan's been on the war against waterfalls for a while. I largely agree. It's a good effort. I think server components make the waterfalls largely move to the server, which reduces their cost significantly. But if we can just get rid of them by having better data loading patterns, obviously we should do that. And as we see here, things are significantly simpler when you have the server driving these things. The client fires an action, the server sends a request to invalidate, the client then goes to fetch the new data, and then it shows the new data. And you have this whole time here where your state is wrong. Maybe you're showing a loading state or something like that. But if you send something to the server, it immediately responds saying, hey, new data is coming. The thing that you had before is old now. And then the client can just show something as the new data comes in without having to do the additional back and forths. Whew, so much cooler. Onwards and upwards. Honestly, there are too many features to talk about with SolidStart because your experience is exactly what you make of it. Client render mode, server-side rendering, static site generation, out-of-order streaming, optimistic UI, key-based cache invalidation, progressively enhanced forms, API routes, parallelized nested route, data fetching, single flight mutation, islands, suspense, transitions, the list goes on. If this list doesn't show you how big of a framework nerd Ryan is, I don't know what will. Because, yeah, what other framework has an author that even knows what all of these are, much less can describe them? In fact, let's go through, count all of these quick as a viewer, as a person in chat, and see how many of these you actually know the meaning of. So client render 1, server rendering 2, static site gen 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 concepts in modern full stack web dev. How many of these do you actually know the meaning of? One that I know a lot of you guys don't know, because it's funny enough, largely a solved problem in our ecosystem now, is out of order streaming. It's crazy to think that we don't talk about this because it's such a goddamn revolution, insanely so. And just no one knows what it is or talks about it. If you're curious about it, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll do a video dedicated to out of order streaming and how well it has been solved over time. This is a framework designed for builders and people who have their own opinions. Maybe that's why I like it. So you guys know, somewhat opinionated, just a little opinionated. We're only beginning to tap into the potential here. That's what we mean by the shape of frameworks to come. SolidStart won't be the last solid framework. We're just getting started. We've already seen people building meta frameworks on top of it, like Create JD app and Media Kit. Create JD app is dope, by the way. JD is a wizard. He created the original solid bindings for upload thing, which was crazy because we just had React at the time, and he just went out rogue, made it work in Solid as well. And our first two frameworks were React through Next in Solid. Create JD app is similar to Create T3 app, but on the Solid side, uses tRPC and a lot of other cool things. Check it out if you're curious about this stuff. As well as Media Kit, which I don't know too much about, honestly. A set of utilities to use with your Solid apps. This is the right one, right? Yeah, this is cool. Nice seeing people building lots of tooling around this stuff already, because that's a huge signal of a healthy ecosystem. Really nice to see this stuff happening. And for that, we, the Solid Core team, are incredibly thankful. Thankful for all the contributors submitting issues and PRs. Thankful for open source projects that make this technology possible, like Vite, Vinxi, and Nitro. Thankful for all the sponsors contributing funding, like Netlify, Chrome, and JetBrains. Most importantly, we're thankful to all of you for embracing development in the open, choosing better over convenient, and sticking with us on the journey. You inspire us to keep building the best solutions we can and to continue to shape the future of web dev. Yes, I wish more people would include this part at the end. I think it does a great job, not just of acknowledging the people who made this possible. More importantly, showing how deeply the Solid team understands and wants to be part of this ecosystem. Other frameworks talk a lot more about themselves, and most framework authors talk a lot more about what they're doing. Ryan's the only creator that I know of that has a framework and spends more of his time talking about other frameworks. Like, watch Ryan's streams if you don't, by the way. His channel is awesome. It's getting more views, but it's still super underrated. He streams pretty much every Friday and goes a lot deeper on these things than I ever could. Really, really cool person, really cool framework, super hyped on what he has here, and honored to be mentioned at the bottom here as a thanks for reviewing the article and being whatever small part I could be. This is a really, really exciting framework, and I couldn't be more hyped for the future of Solid. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you going to give Solid a shot? And if you do, you're going to do it through SolidStart? Let me know. Until next time, peace nerds.